Before people feared werewolves, they signed their names to that fear, not in the forest, not beneath a full moon, but in small rooms where ink dried slowly on paper and a human being was recorded before becoming a legend. And this story begins with records that were never meant to be remembered. Before folklore gave the beast a name, there were rooms like this, small, dark wood, light so weak that everything seemed held inside a dim haze. A table stood at the center. On its surface sat a shallow ink bowl, a quill worn down at the tip. A clerk waited not to hear a monster story, but to write down a statement. Outside, there was no howl carrying from deep woods, no legend drifting on cold wind, only footsteps on frozen ground, guiding a man toward judgment. What remains from that moment is not fear passed from mouth to mouth beside a hearth. It is paper, dates, signatures pressed into sealing wax, words chosen carefully not to frighten, but to document. These are not stories written to be remembered. They are documents written to be completed. And then, across centuries, they remained, waiting to be read again. The records do not carry a storyteller's voice. They do not ask the reader to believe or doubt. They simply exist, silent, like all things made by authority. Each sheet has weight, not only because of ink and wax, but because of the power behind it. In the pre-modern world, paperwork was not an accessory to truth. It was truth. Names were written with care. Dates were framed with clarity. Places were not vague. There was no space for imagination. The people mentioned were not described as strange beings. They were hunters, herdsmen, men living at the village edge. Details so ordinary they feel unsettling. That ordinariness is what makes the page heavy. The records do not recount emotion. They do not concern themselves with fear spreading through a community. They only note what was said, what was seen, what was believed to be enough to move a matter forward. In that coldness, there is no room for legend, at least, not yet. What matters is this: these documents were not created to become history. They were not meant to preserve memory for later generations. They were written to close a case, to restore order to a place that had begun to sway. When the seal was pressed down, the record was considered finished. But time does not respect human intention. As centuries passed, what had once been procedure began to take on a different role. People no longer read these pages to process an accusation. They read them to understand why a community ever needed such lines of ink. Here, in these old and brittle sheets, no beast has been named, only human beings standing before a system built to keep the world from sliding off its familiar track. And at this point, while the record is still intact, while the legend has not yet spoken, a quiet question begins to form. How did these indifferent notes become the foundation for a shape so terrifying? To understand that, it is necessary to step deeper into how these records worked, into the questions that were asked, the procedures that were triggered, and why a single accusation could be enough to turn suspicion into a case. Every record begins the same way, not with a verdict, but with a question, a whisper between neighbors, a behavior labeled unusual, something that no longer fits the village's familiar rhythm. In that world, suspicion does not need clear proof to exist. It only needs to be spoken in the right place, before the right people. Once a question reaches the desk of local authority, it is no longer a private feeling. It becomes a possibility that must be processed. The record begins to take shape from that moment, not because anyone witnessed the extraordinary, but because order has been disturbed. The procedure unfolds slowly, almost mechanically. The name of the person mentioned is written down. The location is fixed. Initial statements are gathered, not to uncover absolute truth, but to measure instability. The system does not ask, "Is this real?" It asks, "Is this serious enough to continue?" In rural communities, the court is not separate from daily life. Those who sit in judgment are not distant figures. They live in the same village, worship in the same church, endure the same unforgiving winters. For that reason, their aim is not to uncover mystery, but to calm fear as it spreads. Every step of the process reflects this. Witnesses are called not because they saw something impossible, but because they felt uneasy. Descriptions of behavior are accepted, If they suggest deviation from the norm, there is no need to prove the unreal. It is enough to show that someone no longer fits within the shared frame. The record does not preserve trembling voices. It does not capture avoiding eyes. It keeps only what can be written down, and that act of selection alters the nature of fear itself. Once placed into administrative language, emotion becomes legitimate, anxiety becomes cause, and suspicion begins to take the shape of a case. At this stage, no beast has yet appeared. There is no accusation of the supernatural. Everything remains within the boundaries of human behavior. Actions that cannot be explained, reactions that cannot be controlled, conduct that makes a community feel unsafe. Yet the very act of placing these things into judicial procedure creates a quiet shift. From the moment a question is set down in writing, it no longer belongs to the one who asked it. It belongs to the system. And that system operates by its own logic, one that favors stability over understanding. What matters is not what the accused may have done, but what the community requires to feel steady again. When the case is formally opened, all eyes turn toward the courtroom, not to await something strange being revealed, but to see whether order can be restored. In that silence, the record continues to thicken, and with each new page, language begins to change, from description to comparison, from human to images more familiar, to collective fear. It is here, within this process that appears purely legal, that something else begins to form, not through myth, but through words, not in the deep forest, but at the very center of the court table. As the record continues to grow thicker, what appears on the page does not change. No nicknames, no symbols, no signs of the supernatural. Only names. Names are written in full, in the manner required by authority. They are paired with estimated birth dates, places of residence, occupations. Sometimes a brief note is added. Lives alone, speaks little, dwells at the village edge. No line strays beyond familiar administrative form, and it is that familiarity that gives the page its weight. The people named in these records are not faceless wanderers. They have histories within the community. They were known before they were suspected. They shared harvests, roads, and long winters. The record does not erase this. It simply lays a layer of text over it. Dates are marked with precision, not to create drama, but to anchor time. Each number pulls the event back to the ground, binding it tightly to reality. There is no space for embellishment, no room for unchecked imagination. Here, everything must stand still in order to be measured. What is striking is how the record describes people through behavior, not essence. No one is called evil. No one is labeled monstrous. There are only actions judged to exceed limits. Wandering at night, violent reactions, fragmented speech, prolonged silence. Taken alone, these details are not enough to define a person. Placed together, they begin to form something else. The record does not attempt to ask why. It does not inquire into circumstance or cause. It only notes that these behaviors unsettled the community. In legal language, that feeling is sufficient to proceed. The prior normality of the person named is no longer treated as protection. It becomes a past detail, pushed quietly aside. It is here that a subtle shift occurs, not on the page, but in how the page is read. When a name appears again and again across multiple sheets, it begins to detach from the living person behind it. It becomes a marker, a point where unresolved fears gather. What matters is this. Up to this moment, there has been no effort to create a creature. The record still keeps the human within the bounds of law. Yet, by assembling ordinary details into a sequence, it accomplishes something else. It begins to blur the line between individual and threat. These pages do not claim the man is a beast. They only show that he no longer fits the shared idea of what a proper human should be. And within a system that places order above all else, that lack of fit is enough to set things in motion. As names continue to be recorded, as dates continue to stack upon one another, the record slowly drifts from its original purpose. It no longer merely documents a case. It is preparing for something else, a shift no one in the room has yet named, but all of them can sense. For from the moment a person is no longer remembered as they once were, The record does not simply reflect reality. It begins to shape how reality will be understood. Those who created these records were not thinking of the future. They were not writing for posterity. They were writing for the present, a present that needed to be stabilized. Each page was completed with a clear purpose: to close uncertainty. When the seal was pressed down, the record was considered finished. No one in that room imagined that centuries later, these lines would be opened again, read slowly, and weighed as evidence of something deeper. Within the logic of that era, a record carried no moral position. It did not stand with the accused, nor did it stand with the community. It stood with order, and in a fragile society, order was the first thing that had to be protected. For this reason, the record did not ask about meaning. It simply documented progression. Who said what, when, where, what made the matter impossible to dismiss. Details that did not serve this purpose were removed. Emotion was unnecessary. Speculation was kept to a minimum. Everything had to be just enough for the system to continue functioning. Yet it was precisely this restraint that created a void. And over time, that void began to attract other interpretations. As records were stored away, forgotten, and later rediscovered, they were no longer read through the same eyes. The world around them had changed. Language had shifted. Things once considered self-evident now felt opaque. The modern reader looks at these pages and senses a misalignment, not because of what is written, but because of what is not said. The record does not explain. It does not justify. It simply exists. And within that silence, imagination begins to fill the space. What is striking is that even when reread, the record still does not tell a complete story. There is no climax, no release, only a stopping point, often a verdict, or a brief administrative decision. After that, everything falls into blankness. It is this blankness that opened the way for something the record was never meant to create. Once the original context was gone, the dry lines of text began to carry different weight. They were joined to collective memory, inherited fears, and the human need to give shape to what cannot be explained. At the moment they were written, no one called the man in the record a monster. No creature was required to resolve the matter. But once the record passed out of the hands of those who created it, once it entered another world, its function changed. It was no longer only an administrative tool. It became a fragment that could be placed into many different images. That is why, though never written to become the foundation of myth, these records still stand at the beginning, not because they contain anything extraordinary, but because they capture the moment when a society began searching for another way to name its own unease. And to understand how such indifferent lines could open the path to a form so frightening, one must move forward, not away from the records, but deeper into how that system operated, into its procedures, its courtrooms, and the questions asked, not to find a beast, but to keep the world from slipping away from its familiar order. Not every suspicion becomes a record. Only those that cross an invisible threshold are preserved. That threshold is not written into law. It lives in communal instinct, in the sense that something has gone too far to be ignored. When behavior can no longer be explained as personal difference, when it begins to disrupt the shared rhythm of life, a question emerges. And when that question is spoken before authority, it begins to change form. The moment a whisper is written down, it no longer belongs to the one who spoke it. It leaves the private sphere and enters another order, the order of paperwork. There, everything must take shape. There must be a date, a signature, a reason clear enough to justify continuation. A record does not begin with an accusation. It begins with notation. A concern has been raised. There have been reports. There has been conduct causing unease. These phrases appear with regularity, like doors opening a little at a time. They assert nothing. They simply allow the system to take another step. In rural communities, where everyone knows one another, committing a question to writing carries particular weight. It is not merely procedural. It is a shift in status. The person named is no longer just a neighbor. Their name now sits on a different list, the list of cases to be reviewed. What matters is this. At this stage, the record still maintains a neutral tone. There is no public judgment, no direct accusation. Yet, that very neutrality creates a sense of safety for the community. If everything is being handled by procedure, fear seems contained. The process is not designed to uncover absolute truth. It is meant to determine the necessity of intervention. The questions asked are not, could this happen? But can this be allowed to continue? When the answer leans toward risk, the record is permitted to move forward. Here, ambiguity is not an obstacle, it is a condition. Vague descriptions, behavior out of the ordinary, reactions deemed excessive, habits described as difficult to explain, all have a place on the page. They do not need to be proven as facts. They only need to be repeated often enough to become noticeable. And it is this repetition that alters the nature of the original question. What began as a private suspicion now takes the shape of a case, not because new evidence has appeared, but because it has been placed inside a sequence of procedures that is difficult to reverse. From this point on, the record is no longer an immediate response. It becomes a process. Each subsequent step, each statement, each note draws the matter farther from its simple point of origin. The initial question, once vague and unsettled, is now fixed in ink, and once fixed, it demands an answer. To find that answer, the system requires another space, a place where roles are clearly defined, where words are weighed, and where order is reaffirmed through ritual. It is there, inside the courtroom, that the record begins to speak in a different voice. The courtroom was not built to inspire fear. It was built to remind people that order still existed. The space was usually small, sometimes no more than a room inside an administrative building or behind a church. Thick wooden walls, narrow windows, light entering in thin bands enough to see the paperwork, but not enough to lift the weight in the air. Everything here was arranged to keep life from slipping beyond its familiar frame. The people seated inside were not strangers. The local judge, the recording clerk, sometimes the priest. They all belonged to the same community as the man brought before them. They knew the road leading to his house. They knew how long his family had lived there. For this reason, the proceeding did not feel like a confrontation. It felt like a collective effort to keep things from coming apart. The man whose name was called did not stand before them as a different species. He remained human, according to the language of the law. But his position in the room had changed. He no longer stood with the community. He stood before it, placed into a role that required evaluation. The questions followed a fixed order, not to uncover the unknown, but to confirm what had already been noted, where he had been on those nights, what he had done, who had seen him, who had heard him. These questions were not searching for the impossible. They were measuring deviation from the norm. Witnesses were called not because they understood what had happened. They were called because they represented shared feeling. Their accounts were often sparse, sometimes contradictory. That did not strip them of value. In this setting, emotional consistency mattered more than factual precision. The clerk sat in silence, recording each answer. The pen moved across the page in an even rhythm. There was no personal comment, no sign of doubt or mercy. Once words were written down, they separated from the speaker. They became part of the record, part of the process unfolding. What stands out is what did not appear in the courtroom. There were no accusations of the supernatural. No one spoke of sorcery or transformation. Such things were not yet necessary. The system was still operating within the bounds of human behavior. It did not yet require a beast to explain itself. Yet even without being named, an invisible pressure was present. Every question, every statement pointed toward a single aim, to determine whether this man could still be placed back into the familiar order. The courtroom was not searching for the strange. It was searching for calm. As the hearing continued, the record grew thicker. The new pages did not bring clarity. They only reinforced the sense that the matter had passed a point of return. Even without a verdict, even without a final conclusion, one thing had become clear. From the moment he stepped into this room, the man was no longer an ordinary individual in the eyes of the system. And to reach its final decision, the courtroom required something else. Not complete truth, but signs strong enough to justify action. It is here that the idea of evidence begins to take on a different meaning. In that courtroom, evidence did not take the familiar shape of modern science. It did not require measurement. It did not require reenactment. It only needed to be persuasive enough for the system to continue operating. What was placed on the table were not physical objects, but accounts. Someone had seen the man wandering at night. Another recalled an unusual burst of anger. Someone else said his eyes were no longer the same. Each account, taken alone, was fragile. Placed beside one another, they began to form mass. Within the logic of that era, behavior was not judged by inner motive. It was judged by outward effect. What mattered was not why a person acted as they did, but how those actions made the community feel. When anxiety was shared by many, it carried value on its own. The descriptions that appear in the records often rely on comparison, not comparison meant to explain, but to locate. The man behaved like an animal. His reactions were instinctual. His silence was wild. These words did not assert anything supernatural. They simply pulled him out of the familiar territory of social language. What is striking is that no one in the courtroom demanded these comparisons be precise. They only needed to be repeated. When different voices reached for the same imagery, it created the sense of agreement. And agreement, in this setting, was a form of evidence. Evidence also did not need to prove the impossible. It only had to show that unease had passed an acceptable limit. Small details, a strange habit, an excessive reaction, a prolonged withdrawal were all admissible. Once placed into the record, they lost their personal quality and became data. The clerk did not distinguish between fact and feeling. He simply wrote down what was said, and in doing so, he gave those words a new status. Once written, sensation became something that could be examined. Fear, framed in legal language, became legitimate. There was no clear standard for dismissing an account. Ambiguity was not treated as a flaw. It was accepted as part of social reality. In a world filled with unpredictability, ambiguity was familiar, and the system learned how to work with it. For this reason, the idea of evidence in these records was not meant to establish an absolute truth. It was meant to create sufficient ground for action. When enough signs were gathered, when enough accounts pointed in the same direction, the record allowed the next step to proceed. By this point, something subtle had occurred. The man in the record was no longer viewed through isolated acts. He was seen as a collection of signs. And that collection began to take on a different shape, not because anyone named it, but because language had slowly given it form. From here on, the courtroom no longer weighed only what had happened. It weighed what might continue, and to face that possibility, the system had to define a deeper purpose for itself, one that extended beyond any single case, toward keeping the community standing. The courtroom never declares its true purpose. It does not need to. On the surface, everything continues according to procedure. Records are read aloud. Testimonies are compared. Familiar details repeat themselves, enough to suggest that the process is moving toward a clear conclusion. Yet beneath that layer of formality, another question quietly guides every decision, a question never written down, but always present. That question is not, what happened? It is, how do we ensure this does not continue? In small communities, the courtroom does not exist to pursue truth in an absolute sense. It exists to settle a condition. When unease has spread far enough, the most urgent task is not to explain each action, but to send a signal. Order is still being guarded. For this reason, hearings are not aimed at fully reconstructing events. They are meant to determine whether intervention is required. When the answer leans toward yes, the remaining details become secondary. What matters is creating a stopping point, a boundary that tells the community their anxiety has been received. At this stage, the record functions as a buffer. It absorbs emotions that cannot be easily named, translates them into administrative language, and places them inside a process that appears rational. Once everything is written down, once each step follows its ritual, fear seems contained, even without a final conclusion. What is striking is that the courtroom does not need to offer a complete explanation to fulfill its role. It only needs to show that a response exists. That deviation has been seen. that the community is not left alone with its concern. By this point, the man in the record has become more than an individual. He stands at the center of a process designed to reaffirm boundaries, not the boundary between right and wrong, but the boundary between what is acceptable and what no longer fits shared life. And it is here that something subtle occurs. As the courtroom completes its stabilizing function, it leaves behind another mark, one never recorded in the minutes. The image of the accused begins to separate from the person himself and attach instead to the repeated descriptions. No one names it, but everyone understands. Once again, the record has no intention of creating a symbol. It does only what is necessary for the system to continue. Yet when the pages are closed, when the matter is considered temporarily resolved, a new space appears. That space is not within the law, but within collective memory. For the courtroom may restore order, but it does not erase the image that has formed. The words that were used remain. The comparisons that were accepted still linger in the air. And when the record leaves the court table, it carries with it another potential, the potential to be retold, reinterpreted, and transformed in ways the courtroom never controlled. It is from this point that the role of language begins to change. No longer confined by procedure, those words prepare to enter another space, one where they no longer merely describe behavior, but gradually shape an image more familiar to human fear. When the record leaves the courtroom, what remains is not only a decision. What remains is language. Those pages, when read again, carry a familiar rhythm, not because they tell the same story, but because they rely on the same set of words. Descriptive phrases recur often enough to create a sense of stability, as if they were chosen not by chance, but because they performed a necessary function. These words do not appear mystical. They are ordinary, unusual behavior, excessive reaction, no longer as before. Each phrase remains open, broad enough to hold multiple meanings, yet clear enough to signal that something has moved beyond accepted bounds. Within the record, repetition is not an error, it is a method. When a way of speaking is used repeatedly by different people, at different moments, it begins to carry weight. No further proof is required. Familiarity itself becomes a form of confirmation. What is striking is how these words operate. They do not describe essence, they describe distance. The distance between a person and what the community expects of them. When that distance is named often enough, it becomes tangible not as an abstract idea, but as a condition that demands response. The record never states that the man has transformed. It only shows that he is no longer seen in the same way, and that shift in perception begins with language. When one behavior is grouped alongside others, when one reaction is compared to reactions that have previously caused concern, language begins to do its work. These words carry another quality as well. They travel easily. They can be repeated beyond the record, in brief conversations, in informal retellings. They require no specialized knowledge. They require only feeling. And feeling, once framed by words, moves with ease. At this stage, the record still maintains its neutral tone. There is no symbolic condemnation. No complete image is drawn. Yet repetition has begun to create a background hum, a layer of meaning beneath the text. The reader does not need to strain to sense that the fragments are pointing toward the same shape. What matters is this: no one in this process intends to create a new story. Each person reaches for words already available, expressions already familiar, but it is precisely that familiarity that allows these words to gather weight. Placed side by side, across many records, they begin to resonate. In this case, language does not merely reflect reality. It shapes how reality is remembered. It creates a frame into which difficult experiences can be placed. And once that frame is strong enough, it can exist independently of the original events. By now, something subtle has occurred. The record still does not speak of a monster, yet language has prepared a space, a place where such an image could appear when needed, not through a single word, but through the slow accumulation of familiar descriptions. And once language has completed its quiet work, the next step no longer belongs to the courtroom. It belongs to the way people begin to compare, not only through speech, but through imagination. Comparison does not appear as an accusation. It appears as a convenient way of speaking. In the records, no one writes that a person has become something else. They only say that the behavior was like something already familiar, like an animal, like instinct, like a reaction no longer guided by reason. These comparisons are not meant to create strange images. They are meant to bring the incomprehensible back into an existing frame of reference. In this context, comparison is a stabilizing tool. When behavior cannot be explained by social norms, placing it alongside the natural world reduces ambiguity. Animals act on instinct. Animals do not require reasons. Animals are not held accountable in the same way humans are. In this way, comparison makes unease easier to organize. What is striking is that these comparisons are not overtly insulting. They are not meant to humiliate the individual before the court. They operate quietly, repeated until they become the default understanding. When someone is described as behaving like an animal, often enough, the question is no longer whether that is true, but whether there is another way to describe it at all. In the courtroom, such comparisons are accepted because they do not stray beyond everyday language. Everyone understands them. Everyone has used them in other contexts. For that reason, they pass without resistance. They move through the room, are written down, and are placed beside one another like reasonable pieces. Once entered into the record, however, comparison begins to serve a different function. It no longer only describes behavior, it repositions the person. The man in the record is still named, but each time that name appears alongside animal-like descriptions, the distance between him and the community grows slightly wider, not because he has changed, but because the way he is spoken about has. Here, there is no clear boundary between legal language and social language. The words used in the record reflect those used outside it, and in return, the record legitimizes ways of speaking that already exist within the community. These two currents meet and reinforce one another without the need for any formal decision. What matters is this: comparison does not create a monster. It creates a gap in the idea of what it means to be human. A gap where familiar standards no longer fully apply. When that gap is named often enough, it becomes a gray zone, a place where an individual is no longer fully protected by the label human. It is in that gray zone that collective fear finds its anchor. No specific image is required. No complete story is needed. Only the sense that someone has stepped beyond a safe boundary. Comparison, simple as it may seem, has done the work of opening the path. The record continues to maintain its neutral tone. No word exceeds what seems necessary. Yet as these comparisons accumulate, they begin to produce a shared image, one not drawn in sharp lines, but clear enough to be recognized when it appears. And from that moment on, the person in the record is no longer seen only through what he has done. He is seen through what he is said to resemble, not because anyone wished to turn him into an animal, but because language had already prepared the way. Across all those pages of record, there is something that almost never appears, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. There is no word monster in the transcripts, no declaration that a non-human creature stepped out of the forest. Legal language does not operate through such concepts. It works with what can be accepted, repeated, and processed through procedure. And within that logic, monster is an excess word. This absence is not accidental. It reflects how the system understands the problem. The record does not need a complete image in order to act. It only needs enough signs to determine that someone has moved away from their familiar place within the community. The comparisons, the descriptions, the repetitions, all of that work has already been done. A stronger word adds nothing. What is striking is that this very absence makes the pages heavier. Without a clear label, the reader is forced to fill the gap. Imagination begins to do what the record does not. It searches for a shape that can hold all the scattered descriptions that have been written down. Inside the courtroom, this causes no difficulty. Those involved understand what is being implied. There is no need to name it. They only need to agree that a deviation exists serious enough to require attention. Language, here, functions as a veil, covering what does not yet need to be spoken. The record thus preserves its neutral appearance. It does not exceed its administrative role. It does not create a symbol. But once read outside its original context, once those who witness the case are no longer present to explain it, that neutrality begins to drift. Later readers do not share the same assumptions. They look at the lines and feel something else. There is no word monster, yet there are too many signs pointing toward a shared image. There is no supernatural accusation, yet there is a sequence of descriptions that push a human being beyond familiar boundaries. The lack of a clear label makes everything more flexible. It allows new interpretations to emerge without resistance from the original text. It is at this point that a quiet shift occurs. What once functioned purely as procedural language begins to carry symbolic potential, not because anyone decided to change the meaning of the record, but because the record never sealed that meaning shut. It left it open. This matters deeply. If the record had named what it described, the later process might have ended there. A specific label would have constrained imagination. But without a name, only signs collective memory is free to assemble the fragments in its own way. From here, the distance between text and memory begins to widen. What was written to serve a specific purpose is slowly read as a clue. Not a clue about events, but about meaning. The man in the record begins to be remembered, not only through names and dates, but through the feeling those lines leave behind. When the record remains silent about the monster, it does not prevent that image from emerging. It merely delays it. And within that delay, something new is forming, not on paper, but in the way people begin to retell what they believe happened. There is no single moment that can be pointed to. No line of text marks the transformation. The beast does not appear in the record, it appears after the record. Once the cases are considered resolved, the papers are filed away. Those involved return to their ordinary lives. The courtroom settles back into its familiar silence. On the surface, order has been restored, but the words that were once used do not vanish with the procedure. They leave the court table and enter another space, the space of memory. There, language is no longer bound by process. Descriptions once recorded for their usefulness are now remembered for the feelings they evoke. Like an animal, instinctual, no longer as before. When these phrases are repeated in brief conversations, they begin to detach from their original context. No more dates, no more signatures, only images. This shift requires no intention. It unfolds according to the natural movement of collective memory. People do not remember records. They remember what the records made them feel, and that feeling vague, unsettled, unnamed searches for a shape stable enough to endure. At this stage, comparison changes its function. It is no longer merely a tool of expression. It becomes a bridge. When a person is remembered through animal-like descriptions, imagination automatically completes what is missing. Not with evidence, but with familiar images already embedded in culture. What matters is this: nothing new needs to be invented. The images already exist. The fear already exists. Language simply brings them together. And when that happens, the man in the record no longer stands alone. He is placed within a wider chain of images, one that has lived in human memory for a very long time. This moment is not an eruption. It is a gentle slide, from documentation to retelling, from behavior to image, from human to something else, yet something familiar enough to be accepted. The beast, in this sense, is not created. It is recognized. The record does not resist this transformation, because it is no longer in a position to do so. Once removed from its original context, the written lines can no longer defend their own meaning. They become points of reference not to verify facts, but to confirm a feeling that has already taken shape. And here, a paradox emerges. The record, written to close a case, opens a new life for it, not in law, but in memory, not as a specific event, but as a pattern. What was once recorded to preserve order now helps sustain an image that lives beyond the system's control. When the beast is finally named in stories, it carries none of the record's details. It carries their residue. No dates, no precise locations, only the sense that someone once stepped beyond a safe boundary and paid the price. From this moment on, the story no longer belongs to the courtroom. It belongs to the way people pass on their fear. And when that happens, the record, silent by nature, has completed a final role it was never written to perform. Once the beast has entered memory, another question begins to surface. Not a question about the creature, but a question about need. The system was never designed to seek out the ambiguous. It exists to manage what threatens stability. And in fragile communities, where life is held together by habit and shared belief, anything that disrupts the familiar rhythm must be given a name, not in order to understand it, but to place it where it belongs. From this perspective, a shape is not the product of wild imagination. It is a tool. When unease cannot be explained through clear causes, when deviant behavior refuses to remain within known categories, society requires a container for it, a shape familiar enough to be accepted, strong enough to gather many anxieties into a single point. This does not happen through official decision. There is no meeting to agree upon it. No law is passed. It unfolds as many social processes do, slowly, unevenly, yet at the same time. The descriptions in the records, the comparisons already in use, the spaces left open by language, all of them converge toward a solution simpler than truth. When a community faces what it cannot control, assigning a shape offers a sense of agency. If fear has a form, it can be contained. If it has a name, it can be spoken of without explanation. And if it has a place beyond the boundary of safety, then the rest of the community can breathe more easily. The system does not need to believe in that shape in order to use it. What matters is effectiveness. Once a shared image appears, it performs a task that law and procedure cannot fully accomplish. It organizes emotion. It allows a community to move from diffuse anxiety to directed vigilance. There is no deliberate malice here. Those involved in the process, judges, clerks, witnesses, do not believe they are creating something beyond their authority. They are responding to pressure to keep things standing. And under that pressure, a shape that can be understood is always more valuable than a question without an answer. What is striking is this: the shape does not need to be accurate. It only needs to be clear enough to be shared. When a community agrees on what does not belong to us, boundaries are reaffirmed. What remains inside those boundaries feels safer, even if that safety is temporary. For this reason, the beast, still not fully named, begins to serve a function. It does not exist to tell a story. It exists to resolve a social problem. When all unease can be placed into a single image, the system achieves what it needs: a measure of calm. But the cost of that calm is not recorded in the files. It lies elsewhere in the fact that one specific human being has been pushed outside the boundary so that the rest may remain within it. And from here, the story no longer turns on where the shape came from, but on who is protected when it appears. Once a shape has been accepted, the next question is no longer what it is. The question becomes, what does it do? In those rural communities, protection was not understood in personal terms. It was not about saving a single individual from immediate danger. It was about keeping the shared structure from collapsing. When fear is gathered and placed outside, the rest of the community can continue to believe that order still holds. Those protected first are not the powerful. They are the quiet majority families who need to believe that the road they walk each day remains safe, that the boundary between us and what is different is still intact. A shared shape allows them to look in one direction, rather than turning in anxious circles. The system itself is protected in the same way. Courtrooms, procedures, and legal language were never created to resolve every contradiction. They exist to preserve the belief that somewhere, order is being maintained. Once a common image is accepted, the system is no longer forced to answer questions it cannot resolve. It only needs to show that the problem has been placed where it belongs. What matters is this: this protection does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be calming. When a community feels that a threat has taken form, it no longer has to confront ambiguity directly. Left unresolved for too long, ambiguity can erode trust in the social foundation itself. Through this process, familiar norms are reinforced, proper ways of living, acceptable behavior, and the unspoken boundary between normal and deviant become clearer. No new text is required. no declaration is made. A single powerful example is enough to remind everyone that certain limits should not be crossed. Those who remain within that boundary, those who still fit the shared image, benefit from this clarity. They can continue living without having to face deeper instabilities. The shared shape absorbs unease on their behalf. It becomes a container for what cannot be spoken in everyday life. This does not unfold in triumph. There is no sense of victory, only relief, a feeling that something has been handled, even if no one can say exactly how. And within that relief, the community continues as before, trusting that order has been restored. But this protection is always selective. It does not extend to everyone. For some to remain inside, someone else must stand outside. This is not stated in the record. It does not need to be written. The system's aim was never absolute fairness. Its aim was stability that could endure. And it is here that a clear boundary is drawn, not between right and wrong, but between belonging and no longer belonging. Once that boundary is accepted, protection becomes visible, and the cost of it begins to appear on the other side. Protection never exists on its own. It is always paired with exclusion. Once a community finds a shape in which to place its fear, boundaries become clearer. Not boundaries on a map, but boundaries of perception. Those who remain inside are understood as normal. Those who stand outside need no specific label. It is enough that they are seen as no longer belonging. The man in the record crosses that boundary not in a sudden rupture, but by sliding over it slowly, through each page, each description, each repeated comparison. No one rises to declare that he has been expelled. Yet once the system completes its role, his place within the community has changed. This exclusion does not always take the form of public punishment. Sometimes it is only prolonged silence, avoided glances, growing distance, familiar paths narrowing. In many cases, the record ends before social life finishes the work. But that does not mean the process stops. What is striking is this: the system no longer needs to intervene to sustain exclusion. Once a shared image has been accepted, the community adjusts itself. What was once overlooked becomes a warning sign. Small behaviors are read differently. The person is no longer seen through their history, but through the image that has formed. Here, there is no confusion about purpose. Exclusion is not meant to punish an individual. It is meant to send a wider signal, a reminder that there are limits not to be crossed, even when no one can fully explain why. The excluded individual becomes an anchor for fear, a living example of what happens when boundaries blur. This exclusion also brings a new order to memory. Complex details of the real person are gradually stripped away. Past years, former relationships, earlier familiarity fade from mention. Only what fits the new role remains. Collective memory, like the record before it, learns how to select. This is why exclusion often lasts longer than the case itself. Files can be closed, courtrooms can fall silent, but an image once placed does not easily disappear. It lives on in brief stories, quiet warnings, knowing looks. It continues its work without the need for documents. Through this process, the individual pushed outside is no longer treated as a question that requires answering. They become a conclusion that has been accepted. And when a conclusion is accepted long enough, it is no longer examined. It is only repeated. For this reason, exclusion is not merely a consequence. It is part of the mechanism, a way for the community to keep the rest of itself intact. Yet that mechanism, effective in the short term, always leaves behind a void where unspoken tensions continue to gather, waiting for the moment when another shape will be needed to contain them. When the entire process is viewed in retrospect, what emerges is not chaos. It is a structure. The beast, in this sense, does not appear as an accident of imagination. It appears as a provisional answer, an imperfect solution, yet effective enough for society to continue functioning. As unanswerable questions begin to accumulate about behavior, about violence, about deviation, a shared shape allows everything to be rearranged. That solution does not need to be correct. It only needs to be accepted. In pre-modern rural communities, where science had not yet provided language for many human conditions, society was forced to rely on existing frames of understanding. The beast does not explain cause. It locates consequence. It declares that something has crossed a boundary, and that what crossed it no longer belongs to us. In this way, the shared shape eases the burden on the system. Rather than confronting difficult questions about illness, about the mind, about circumstance, society shifts its focus to boundaries, the boundary between human and not human, between acceptable and no longer acceptable. Once that boundary is established, many other tensions subside on their own. What is striking is this: the solution does not require total agreement. Not everyone believes the same thing, but belief is not required. People only need to act as if the shape carries meaning. Once enough people do so, the shape becomes a social reality, regardless of its origin. The beast, in this role, does not exist to be understood. It exists to be used. It is used to warn, to deter, to reinforce norms that are otherwise fragile. When someone steps too far, the image stands ready as a reminder that certain costs do not need to be spelled out. Legal records never name this solution, yet they create the conditions for it to form. By documenting deviation without explanation, by allowing comparative language to repeat, by closing cases before all questions are answered, the system leaves behind a void, and that void is filled by the most familiar shape available. This does not mean society was wrong in a simple sense. It reflects the limits of its time. Lacking tools for deeper understanding, people reached for structures that allowed them to endure. The beast, therefore, is not merely a sign of cruelty. It is evidence of an attempt to maintain balance in an unpredictable world. But every solution carries consequences. When a shape is used to contain too much fear, it begins to live a life of its own. It detaches from the specific case. It becomes a template, a ready-made lens that can be applied again whenever needed. And from here, the story enters another phase. It is no longer about how society created the shape, but about how that shape continues to exist after the records have been closed. For while the system may consider the matter finished, memory never obeys the same order. At some point, the record stops, not because every question has been answered, but because the system has reached its limit. The seal is pressed down. The final pages are stacked neatly. The hearing no longer appears in new entries. For the courtroom, the matter has fulfilled its function. Order has been restored enough for life to continue moving forward. There is no formal closing ritual, no declaration that everything is well. The ending arrives quietly, the way most administrative processes do. When there is nothing left that requires intervention, the system withdraws. And in that withdrawal, a space is left behind. The man who once stood before the court no longer appears in subsequent records. His name is not mentioned again. There is no follow-up note. Legally, he has passed beyond the scope of concern. But the absence of further documentation does not mean a return to his former place. When the record closes, it does not carry restoration with it. It has no mechanism for that. It knows only how to open and how to shut. What has been recorded remains as it was. The descriptions that exist are not withdrawn, and so the final silence does not erase the images formed before it. Within the community, the closing of the case does not bring full relief. It brings familiarity. A new condition is accepted without explanation. People speak less about what happened, but their way of seeing has changed. Questions that once stirred unease are replaced by the sense that things have been dealt with. What is striking is this: the absence of a concluding narrative allows memory to continue its work. Without an official story to hold on to, the community assembles fragments that fit the remaining feeling. Details that no longer matter fall away. Images that evoke fear are kept. The record does not resist this. It cannot. Once placed on a shelf, it no longer participates in social life. But what it leaves behind, language, comparisons, boundaries, continues to exist beyond it. The case, though closed on paper, remains open in memory. From this moment on, the beast no longer needs the courtroom to exist. It has found another place to reside, a space unconcerned with procedure, unbound by dates, uninterested in precision. The space of stories retold in simpler, more memorable forms. When the case is considered finished, society moves into another phase. No more processing, no more debate, only the quiet repetition of images that have already taken shape. And within that repetition, what was once a temporary solution begins to take on the weight of something more enduring. When the records are no longer opened, something else begins to do their work. Not more accurate, only more enduring. Memory does not operate like paperwork. It does not require clear dates, signatures, or seals. It keeps what is easiest to remember, not what happened, but what left the strongest impression. And when the record withdraws from communal life, memory steps into the space it leaves behind. Administrative details slowly fade. No one remembers exactly when the hearing took place, or how the testimonies were recorded. What remains are fragments of image, a man once suspected, a period of tension, a lingering sense that something had gone wrong. Memory reorganizes everything according to its own logic. In this process, language continues to simplify. Lengthy descriptions from the record are reduced to a few familiar images. Complexity is stripped away. Details that do not serve retelling are forgotten. Only what is strong enough to pass from one person to another without explanation remains. What matters is this: memory does not preserve the person. It preserves the role. The man in the record is no longer remembered as an individual with a personal history. He becomes a sign, an example, a quiet reminder that there are boundaries not meant to be crossed. Memory does what the record never did. It abstracts. In brief conversations, stories begin to be told in the same way. Accuracy is not required. Familiarity is. When an image is repeated often enough, it becomes a template. And a template, once formed, can exist independently of its origin. Here, the difference between memory and history becomes clear. History requires evidence. Memory requires agreement. When enough people share the same image, it is no longer questioned. It is accepted as part of a shared reality, even if that reality has been greatly simplified. The beast, in this context, does not need to be fully described. It only needs to be implied. A look, a pause, a sentence left unfinished. Memory works best when it does not say everything. What remains is filled in by what the community is already prepared to believe. This explains why, over time, the story does not become clearer. It becomes leaner. Contradictions are worn down. Details that do not fit are pushed aside. Memory selects what allows it to survive the longest, not what is most faithful to truth. And once memory has replaced the record, the beast no longer needs any proof. It does not require a courtroom to exist. It lives in the way people recall their past, as a vague warning, a familiar shadow standing at the edge of what is accepted. From here on, the story no longer belongs to a single case. It becomes part of the shared current of memory, something that can be summoned whenever a community needs to remind itself of its boundaries and of the cost of stepping beyond them. History rarely returns to amend itself. It only continues forward. Once memory replaces the record, no one remains responsible for keeping the story precise. The lines once written with administrative care are no longer cross-checked. No one reopens the file to say that something was misunderstood. No one steps forward to withdraw the images that have taken root. That silence is not a deliberate choice. It is a consequence of how history functions. When an image has been widely accepted, correcting it requires more than evidence. It requires will. And such will rarely appear once order has been maintained. Later generations do not inherit the records. They inherit the story. A story smoothed by time, stripped of complexity, retaining only the contours strong enough to leave an impression. What no longer serves transmission disappears, not because it is false, but because it is no longer needed. Here, history does not distort truth outright. It does something subtler. It omits. When what was once procedure is retold as memory, the distance between what happened and what is remembered begins to widen. That distance does not feel troubling. It becomes familiar. No one feels compelled to ask again. The story has already done its work. It has explained enough to justify why certain boundaries should not be crossed. It has placed fear into a stable image. And as long as that function remains effective, revisiting origins seems unnecessary. What is striking is this: Even if the records still exist somewhere in archives, in rooms rarely entered, they no longer compete with memory. Paper requires time, patience, and a reason to be read. Memory does not. It lives in brief phrases, familiar hints, in the feeling that this once happened. And so history does not correct the story. It allows it to run alongside, as a parallel current, a current that requires no proof, no verification, only repetition. When repetition lasts long enough, it becomes self-evident. At this point, the beast is no longer tied to any specific person. It has been detached from its origin. It becomes a template, a ready-made way of understanding that can be applied whenever a community needs to name what it cannot explain. History does not intervene in this process. It merely watches, continuing to accumulate new layers of sediment. And within that absence of correction, something important is preserved. Not the truth of the record, but the function of the story. People do not need to know exactly what happened in order to use the image. They only need to believe that it once happened. When history remains silent, memory speaks. And when memory has spoken long enough, it no longer requires permission from the past. It stands on its own, like all stories that survive time, by answering a deeper need than accuracy. When every layer has fallen away, what remains is not the question of the beast, nor is it whether it ever truly existed. What remains is silence. The records were placed on shelves long ago. Those who once took part in the case have faded from living memory. The courtroom no longer carries traces of the old hearings. If one were to stand there today, there would be nothing to suggest that this space was once the starting point of an image that endured across generations. But absence does not mean an end. The images shaped by memory do not require a fixed place to survive. They live in how people respond to the unfamiliar, in the caution stirred by behavior that cannot be explained, in the instinct to search for boundaries whenever order feels fragile. The beast may no longer be named, but its position remains. This reveals a quiet truth. Things created to resolve a moment rarely disappear entirely. They change form. The image that once helped a community steady itself continues to exist as a pattern, ready to be activated when needed. Even if no one remembers the original reason, there is no clear conclusion to draw from the old records. They do not teach a lesson. They do not offer a final judgment. They simply show how people once faced what they did not understand, using the tools available to them at the time. And perhaps what invites the deepest reflection is not the beast itself, but the silence surrounding it. The silence of pages that have completed their task. The silence of history as it allows memory to follow its own path. The silence of a community that accepts an image in place of a more difficult explanation. Those records still exist. Somewhere, in archives few people enter. They have not changed. Only the way they are read has. And each time they are opened, they do not answer new questions. They only remind us that there was once a time when fear was written into words, and those words traveled farther than the people who set them down. In that sense, the beast does not need to remain present to continue having an effect. Its role was completed long ago. What remains is how people still rely on old images to confront new uncertainties, repeating a response shaped over time. And when the lights in the archive are turned off, when the files return to their familiar darkness, the story does not truly end. It only steps back far enough to become background, close enough to be summoned whenever order once again begins to waver.